The sound that split the silence that morning wasn't the cry of a bird or the rustle of wind through pine. It was the deep grinding roar of machinery. Engines on our land. When I stepped out of the truck, I could smell the sharp tang of wet concrete and see fresh tire tracks carved deep into the dirt I'd known since childhood. But what froze me wasn't the noise, it was the sight. A gleaming white structure, modern and alien against the forest's edge, stood where open space had always been. Its polished glass reflected the rising sun like a warning flare. At first I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, that maybe somehow we'd driven up the wrong trail. But then I saw the old cedar stump near the bend, the one my grandfather carved his initials into 50 years ago. No mistake, this was our land. And someone had built an entire building on it. It wasn't a shed or a cabin. It was something official, something corporate. A sign near the entrance shimmered in the light. Private HOA property, recreational office, restricted access. The words burned into my mind. My stomach turned cold. They hadn't just crossed the line, they'd erased it. I remember Emily's voice behind me, low but trembling with anger, asking how this was even possible. I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was the locked gate we passed on the way in, the one that hadn't been there before. The one with a brand new padlock and a camera pointed straight at the road. In that moment, standing there in the dust and morning light, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, violation. They had taken what was ours without warning, without permission. They'd built their empire on land that carried our family name. But what they didn't know was that we were coming back, not just to reclaim what was ours, but to expose every lie they'd buried beneath those foundations. Because the deeper we dug, the more rot we found. And by the time we were done, that shiny new building would become the symbol of their downfall. They thought they could steal from us and walk away clean. But tell me, what happens when the people you've wronged decide they're done playing by your rules? When I first moved to Maplewood Heights, I thought I'd found paradise. Rows of freshly painted homes curved along clean, tree-lined streets, their driveways immaculate, their lawns perfectly manicured as if someone had sliced each blade of grass with a ruler. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and new asphalt, a strange but oddly comforting combination that whispered of order, structure, safety. To most people, it was the American dream, neatly trimmed and HOA approved. The neighborhood was built around a sparkling lake, ringed by a walking trail and benches that glistened with the HOA's relentless maintenance budget. Every home was required to use the same style of mailbox, the same shade of beige siding, and even the same type of outdoor lighting. The rules weren't suggestions, they were commandments etched into a thick binder you received at closing. And for a while, I didn't mind. I liked the symmetry, the silence, the way the world here seemed so perfectly measured. My home sat at the end of Birch Lane, just a few steps from the cul-de-sac. It was a modest two-story place, with a wrap-around porch and a garden I'd inherited from the previous owner, a riot of wildflowers that constantly threatened to spill over the stone border and invade the pristine lawns next door. Every morning before work, I'd water the garden, sip my coffee, and watch the sunlight move across the lake. I felt peace here, real peace, the kind that comes after years of renting noisy apartments and dealing with thin walls and bad neighbors. But Maplewood Heights wasn't just a neighborhood. It was an ecosystem ruled by a small but powerful council, the HOA board. 5 people who seemed to believe they were running a miniature nation, complete with their own laws, punishments, and political hierarchies. At the head of it all was Marjorie Caldwell. Everyone called her Miss Caldwell, though she was only in her early 60s. She wore pastel cardigans, pearls, and an expression that could curdle milk. Her house was the largest on the lake, its hedges shaped like chess pieces, its flagpole gleaming at sunrise. Marjorie didn't just chair the HOA, she was the HOA. Every rule had her fingerprints on it. Then there was Frank, the treasurer, a retired accountant with a permanent squint and a love for measuring things. He once fined a neighbor because their garbage bins were 2 inches beyond the curb. There was Diane, who handled community engagement, which really meant gossip disguised as newsletters. She had a way of smiling that made you feel she already knew something about you and that she was saving it for later. Rounding out the group were Peter and Lyle, both middle-aged men who treated every HOA meeting like a courtroom drama, constantly interrupting each other with shouts of "point of order." At first, I didn't pay much attention to their antics. My days were simple: work, garden, dinner, repeat. The HOA would send the occasional newsletter about pool hours or lawn care reminders, but nothing felt sinister. In fact, my first few months were blissfully quiet. Neighbors waved, dogs barked, sprinklers hissed in rhythm. It all seemed normal. Then came the first notice. It was tucked under my doormat one Saturday morning, a pale yellow envelope stamped with the HOA seal. Inside was a friendly reminder that my garden's wildflowers were in violation of neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. Specifically, they did not align with the pre-approved color palette of the community. I remember reading it twice, wondering if it was some kind of joke. Flowers, apparently, were too rebellious for Maplewood Heights. I trimmed them back. Reluctantly, but the next week, I received another notice, this time about a non-standard porch light fixture. The one I had came with the house, a vintage black lantern that I loved for its charm. According to the HOA, it was not compliant with Section 4, subparagraph B. I replaced it with the approved silver model. Swallowing my irritation, at the next board meeting, I decided to attend in person just to understand what was going on. The community center was packed, mostly retirees in folding chairs, murmuring complaints about leaves, parking, and fence heights. Marjorie stood at the front like a judge, tapping her pen against a clipboard as each topic came up. When I introduced myself as a new homeowner, she smiled thinly. "Oh yes," she said. "The one with the flower problem?" A few people chuckled. I didn't. The meeting went on for nearly 2 hours. Every item seemed trivial, yet the board debated each one as if the fate of civilization depended on it. By the end, I understood the hierarchy of Maplewood Heights. Marjorie gave orders, Frank enforced them, Diane spread them, and everyone else obeyed. Those who didn't were quietly pressured, isolated, or, if that failed, fined until they either complied or moved away. After that night, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Cars that slowed when passing my house. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly looking away. A feeling of being watched, not just by people but by the neighborhood itself. Security cameras seemed to sprout overnight, attached to lampposts and corners of roofs. For community safety, the next newsletter said. But it didn't feel like safety. It felt like surveillance. One afternoon, while mowing the lawn, I saw Diane standing across the street pretending to check her mailbox, but staring directly at me. When I waved, she smiled too late, too forced. Moments later, my phone buzzed with a new email. Reminder, lawn height must not exceed 3 inches. It became a pattern. Every small detail of my life scrutinized, documented, corrected. The mailbox flag, too high. My recycling bin, not aligned. Even my car, a dark blue pickup, was deemed inconsistent with the visual character of the neighborhood. Each complaint arrived in a neatly folded envelope, signed with that same seal, but I wasn't the only one. My next-door neighbor, a quiet man named Carl, once mentioned getting fined for leaving his kids' bikes in the driveway overnight. Another resident, Mrs. Patel, had been reprimanded for hanging wind chimes that produced excessive sound. It was ridiculous, but most people complied, because resisting the HOA meant war. One evening, Carl invited me over for a beer in his backyard. We sat near his grill, the air thick with smoke and mosquitoes, and he told me something that made my stomach drop. "You know that family that used to live in your house before you?" he said. "They fought with the HOA, tried to file a complaint. Next thing you know, their mortgage company started getting anonymous reports about property damage. They sold within 3 months? I laughed it off, but it stuck in my mind. And as the weeks passed, I noticed more signs of that quiet power at work. Houses sold abruptly, new owners moving in fast, always the compliant kind. The ones who planted roses in straight lines and waved politely but never asked questions. The breaking point came the morning I found a notice taped directly to my front door. Final warning, unapproved landscaping. My crime this time? The wildflowers had grown back, bright, defiant splashes of red and purple in a world of beige and green. That same afternoon, I caught Frank pacing in front of my house with a tape measure, jotting something in his notebook. When I stepped outside, he startled and muttered something about routine inspection. I asked him to leave. He didn't. He just smiled that tight, condescending smile and said, "You'll understand once you've been here longer. Rules keep us civilized." That night I couldn't sleep. The street was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I sat on the porch, watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a car door slam, then another. Headlights flashed briefly across the street, and I saw Diane's silhouette through her window, phone to her ear, staring straight toward my house. I didn't know it yet, but that was the night things started to shift. The night the invisible line between irritation and invasion began to blur. From that point on, every decision I made, every small act of defiance, would come with a price. Because Maplewood Heights wasn't a community. It was a kingdom, and I had just unknowingly declared war on its queen. Still, back then, I thought I could handle it. I thought reason would win out, that people would see how absurd it all was. But reason doesn't survive long in a place built on control. And soon, I'd learned that the HOA's obsession with order ran deeper and darker than anyone imagined. There was something underneath the perfect lawns and tidy fences, something they were desperate to keep hidden. And the closer I got to uncovering it, the harder they'd push back. At the time, I didn't know that my wildflowers were the spark that would ignite everything, that they would become a symbol not just of defiance, but of freedom, and of the secret this neighborhood had buried for years. But standing there that summer evening, watching the sprinklers flicker on across the street, I could already feel the tension thickening, invisible but real. The kind that hums beneath the surface of a smile. The kind that waits, and when it finally snapped, Maplewood Heights would never be the same again. It started with the letters. They came one by one, each stamped with the Maplewood Heights HOA insignia. A golden tree inside a perfect circle, its roots sprawling like claws. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. The first letter accused me of exceeding lawn ornament limits. Apparently, my single garden gnome, an old chipped one I'd inherited from my father, counted as an unapproved decorative fixture. I laughed, tossed the notice on the counter, and forgot about it. The second letter came 3 days later. Violation number 2041B. Grass length exceeds regulation height. I measured it myself, 2 3/4 inches. Perfectly legal. But that didn't matter. The letter carried a $50 fine and a warning that future non-compliance would result in additional penalties. Then came the third. And the fourth. By the time summer hit its peak, my mailbox looked like it was bleeding paper, each envelope more threatening than the last. Failure to comply may result in legal escalation. Your property has been reported for repeated violations. Final notice. They weren't just watching, they were building a case. The first time I realized how far they were willing to go was one muggy afternoon. In July, I came home from work to find 2 men in orange vests pacing through my yard with clipboards. When I asked who they were, one flashed a badge that read HOA Enforcement Committee. A committee? For grass. They claimed they were conducting an unscheduled inspection due to multiple reports of unsanctioned flora. Unsanctioned flora! My mouth went dry. That evening, I emailed Marjorie directly. The response came within minutes. All inspections are authorized under the Maplewood Heights Covenant, Article 6, Section 12. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Nothing to fear! That phrase looped in my head as I looked out my window later that night. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road. In one of them stood Diane, half hidden behind her hydrangeas, pretending to water them while whispering into her phone. Her eyes never left my porch. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something had shifted. By mid-August, the fines totaled over $1,000. Every time I called to dispute them, Frank, the treasurer, answered with the same syrupy calmness. We understand your frustration, but rules are rules. He always paused just long enough to let the silence dig into me before adding, wouldn't want this to escalate, would we? Then came the first real blow. One morning, I walked outside to find my mailbox gone. The post ripped from the ground, bolts scattered like teeth. A small white card fluttered nearby. Mailbox not HOA approved. Replacement scheduled. The next day, a crew arrived without notice and installed a new one, identical to everyone else's, uniform and sterile. When I asked who approved it, they said, "The board did. It's already billed to your account, $275. That night, I sat in the dark at my kitchen table, surrounded by letters and fines. I tried to breathe, to reason, but the sound of gravel crunching outside froze me. A car idled across the street. Its headlights off, I stood slowly, peeking through the blinds, the silhouette of someone holding a camera. The flash blinked once, twice, then the car drove off. The next morning, a new violation notice appeared in my inbox. Unsecured trash bins visible from roadway. Fine $100. That was when I started keeping a journal. Dates, times, photos, evidence of everything. I didn't know it then, but that journal would save me later. The pressure grew in subtle, insidious ways. Diane began dropping by to check in, pretending to bring homemade muffins while asking invasive questions about my work hours, my visitors, even my family. When I didn't take the bait, she'd smile thinly and glance around my living room like she was inspecting it for something out of place. One afternoon, she noticed a framed photo of my late father in uniform and asked, "Does the HOA know about your military discount?" Some residents feel that kind of privilege needs review. I didn't even know what that meant. But her tone made my skin crawl. A week later, I received a letter stating that my flagpole, a simple 5-foot stand I'd installed in honor of my dad, was unapproved. The irony burned. I appealed the decision. They denied it. Then they started targeting the little things. I found orange stickers on my recycling bin, my garden hose, even my porch chairs. Each one marked non-compliant. It was as if they were branding every piece of my life. Carl, my neighbor, warned me. "They're trying to break you down," he said one night over the fence. His voice was low, wary. That's what they do. They pick someone, push them until they crack. Makes everyone else too scared to question them. A few days later, Carl got his own notice. Unauthorized fence repairs. He hadn't repaired anything. He moved out within 2 months. His house sold fast, too fast. The new owners were overly polite, eerily quiet, and immediately joined the HOA board's Neighborhood Watch program. That's when I realized I was being isolated. The other neighbors stopped talking to me. Kids avoided my yard when riding their bikes. Even the mailman started delivering from the edge of my driveway, refusing eye contact. The air itself began to feel heavy, tense, like the whole street was holding its breath. One evening, I decided to attend another board meeting. This time, I recorded it. The room was colder than I remembered, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. When my name came up on the agenda, Marjorie smiled that same venomous smile. "Ah, yes, Mr. Lawson, the non-compliance case." I tried to stay calm as I explained the situation, how the fines were unfounded, how the rules were applied unfairly. The moment I finished, Peter, one of the board members, leaned back in his chair and said, "If you don't like the rules, maybe Maplewood Heights isn't the right fit for you," the audience murmured. I caught Diane's smirk in the corner of the room. Frank tapped something into his tablet. Marjorie folded her hands and said softly, "Let's be clear, Mr. Lawson. Defiance only makes things harder. The HOA's authority is not optional authority." That word hit me like a slap. When I got home that night, my driveway was blocked. 2 HOA-marked cones stood at the entrance with a sign, "Parking violation pending review." I removed them and parked anyway. The next morning, I found my tires slashed. The police took a report, but said there were no cameras facing that direction. Every HOA security camera conveniently pointed away from my property. When I asked for footage from the board system, Marjorie claimed the files had been accidentally overwritten. Days later, my electricity went out. The utility company told me my payment had been suspended due to a billing dispute. I checked my bank account. Showed a large withdrawal labeled HOA. Maintenance fee? They had drafted an unauthorized charge that overdrew my account. It was no longer about lawns or lights. It was psychological warfare. I started fighting back quietly. I printed out the HOA bylaws, studied every clause, every loophole. I found inconsistencies, contradictions, hidden amendments that allowed them to fine without oversight. Late one night, while combing through old meeting minutes archived online, I found something strange. A motion from 5 years ago labeled Property Recovery Initiative. It authorized the board to reclaim homes that were repeatedly fined and failed to maintain compliance. It was legal theft, and worse, it had already happened twice. Both times, the homes were sold under HOA authority to new compliant residents. Marjorie's signature appeared on both transfers. The next day, I confronted her in person. She was pruning her roses when I approached. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost graceful. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," she said without looking up. "I know what you're doing," I said. My voice shook, but I didn't back down. "You're weaponizing fines to push people out." "That's illegal." She finally met my eyes, cold, unblinking. "Illegal?" she echoed softly. "We're a private association. We have full authority over property standards. If you want to keep your home, Mr. Lawson, I suggest you start cooperating." It was a threat wrapped in civility. That night, my security camera caught something. 2 figures walking up my driveway just after midnight. One held a flashlight. The other carried what looked like a clipboard. They stopped by my porch, scribbled something, then disappeared. The next morning, a red tag was taped to my door. "Property review scheduled. Entry authorized, entry authorized." They planned to enter my home. I called the police again. This time they shrugged. "It's an HOA matter," the officer said. "We can't interfere with association policies." That's when I realized how deep it went. The HOA had the local authorities in their pocket, or at least enough influence to keep them indifferent. The stress began eating at me. Sleep became impossible. I'd hear the faint sound of cameras whirring at night, the hum of a car engine idling down the street. I started keeping the lights on, checking the locks twice before bed. One evening, as I was reviewing footage on my laptop, I noticed something chilling. Every time I left the house, a white SUV appeared within minutes. Different plates, same make and model. All was parked near the entrance of the neighborhood. Always watching, I began to document everything obsessively. I knew what they were doing. They wanted me to break, to sell, to disappear quietly like the others. But I wasn't going anywhere. Then came the community barbecue, the annual Harmony Day, where residents were required to attend. I considered skipping it, but a letter warned that failure to participate in mandatory social events could result in penalties. So, I went. The event was staged at the lakefront. Tents lined up like a festival, laughter echoing through the air. For a moment I almost forgot, until I noticed the whispers, the stares. Conversations paused when I approached. I was the outcast, the cautionary tale. Halfway through, Marjorie took the microphone. "We value unity here," she announced sweetly, "and we believe our community thrives when we all play by the same rules." Her gaze found me in the crowd. Unfortunately, some residents seemed to think they're above them. Laughter rippled. I left early, fists clenched, but when I got home my heart nearly stopped. My front yard was destroyed. The wildflowers ripped up by their roots, soil scattered like a crime scene. My porch light smashed. My front door vandalized with red spray paint. Follow the rules. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was open war. That night, something inside me hardened. The fear turned to resolve. I made copies of every document, every photo, every letter. I compiled a dossier, a full account of their harassment. I sent it anonymously to the county records office, the local newspaper, and a legal aid group that specialized in HOA abuse. I didn't know what would come of it, but I knew one thing: they had crossed the line. Still, as I watched the shadows move across my street that night, I realized the fight was only beginning, because Marjorie and her board weren't just defending rules. They were protecting something far more valuable, and soon I'd uncover what that was, but not before they tried to destroy me first. The first sign that everything was about to explode came in the form of a noise, a deep, mechanical rumble that rolled through the morning fog like thunder. At first, I thought it was distant construction. But as I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, I saw them. 3 trucks. 2 marked Maplewood Heights Enforcement Division, and 1 plain white van idling at the end of my driveway. Men in safety vests climbed out, followed by a tall, thin man in a gray suit. He carried a clipboard and an air of smug authority. I recognized him immediately. Marjorie's attorney, a man named Kemp, Mr. Lawson. He called out, his voice too loud for the still morning. We're here to carry out a board-approved property seizure. The words didn't make sense at first. Seizure? He waved a document. You've accumulated unpaid fines exceeding $18,000. Under the Maplewood Covenant, your property has been repossessed for non-compliance. My stomach dropped. I knew this was their endgame, but to see it happening in real time was surreal, like a nightmare bleeding into reality. I forced my voice steady. You can't do that. You know this is illegal, Kemp smiled faintly. Everything we do is by the book, Mr. Lawson. Now please vacate the premises. Behind him, the workers began unloading plywood boards, crowbars, padlocks. They were going to lock me out, again, but this time, permanently. I pulled out my phone and began recording. You touch that door and you'll regret it, I said flatly. You have no court order, no sheriff, no warrant. Kemp didn't flinch. We don't need one. HOA bylaws supersede standard eviction protocol. That was it. The mask was off. I called the police, but as the phone rang, 2 patrol cars appeared at the end of the street. Relief flooded through me until I saw who stepped out. Officer Gregson, the same one who'd dismissed every report I'd filed for months. He walked up to Kemp, not me, and shook his hand. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. They'd coordinated it. Gregson turned to me. Sir, I need you to cooperate. They have the paperwork. I held up my phone. They have forged paperwork. Kemp's smirk deepened. You're welcome to take it up in civil court, but as of today, this property belongs to Maplewood Heights. That's when I noticed the drone. It was hovering just above the treetops, its red light blinking faintly in the fog. Emily's drone. She was watching from the neighbor's field where we'd hidden it the night before. Every word, every movement, captured. I smiled then. For the first time in weeks, I actually smiled. All right, I said quietly. Let's play this your way. I walked back inside, pretending to pack a few things. In reality, I was gathering the last pieces of my plan. My binder of evidence, the USB drives, the flashcards labeled meeting minutes, forgery vote, and at the top, copies of the deeds from the county's office that Don Moffat himself had verified. I heard hammers pounding outside. They were boarding up my windows. Each nail felt like a countdown. When I stepped back onto the porch, Kemp looked pleased with himself. Glad to see you're cooperating, he said. I held out my folder. Here, take this to your board. He hesitated, then reached for it. The moment he did, I said, you've just accepted to service of a legal complaint. His smug expression faltered. That's right, I continued. Filed with the county recorder, the Attorney General's office, and the local news network that's been following your little property recovery initiative. The color drained from his face. At that moment, Emily's drone dipped lower, its camera locking onto his face. A red light blinked. Live streaming. You're being recorded, I said calmly. Every word of this conversation, every nail you've driven into that wall, is evidence of criminal trespass and fraud. Behind him, the workers froze. Even Gregson looked uneasy. Kemp tried to recover. This is outrageous, is it? I cut him off. Because the county investigator doesn't think so. Neither does Channel 9, who'll be airing this footage tonight. You really thought no one would notice you stealing private land under fake easements? Emily's voice crackled through the drone's speaker. Smile for the news, Mr. Kemp. He spun around, looking up, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. That's when the second wave arrived. 3 county vehicles rolled down the street, followed by 2 black SUVs with the sheriff's insignia. Don Moffat stepped out, flanked by deputies. His face was grim. Kemp, he barked. Step away from the property. What's the meaning of this? Kemp demanded, his voice cracking. The meaning, Don said, holding up a warrant, is that the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association is under investigation for fraud, falsification of land records, and illegal seizure of private property. Marjorie's car screeched to a stop a few yards away. She stumbled out, her perfect composure gone. You can't do this, she shouted. We followed every protocol. No, Don interrupted. "You followed your own rules." "The problem is, you're not the law," the sheriff motioned to his deputies. "Secure the scene." The workers dropped their tools immediately. Gregson looked like he wanted to vanish. Kemp's phone buzzed nonstop, probably his board members panicking as the news broke. I stood there, silent, as it all unfolded. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut around Kemp's wrists was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Marjorie tried to argue, screaming about property values, community standards, everything she'd ever preached from that smug chair at the board meetings. But Don cut her off with a single line. "You forged people's deeds. That's not management. It's theft." The crowd had started forming by then, neighbors drawn out by the sirens, the shouting, the flashing lights. Some looked confused, others guilty. Diane stood near the curb, clutching her phone, her face pale. When our eyes met, she looked away. Deputies began tearing down the plywood from my windows. My home was mine again, but I wasn't done. I turned to Marjorie. "Do you remember what you told me?" I asked. "That the HOA's authority wasn't optional?" She glared, her lips trembling. "Well," I said quietly, "neither is justice." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Don handed me a copy of the warrant. "You were right about everything," he said. "Every document you sent us checked out. They've been targeting homeowners for years, using the same fake bylaws, the same forgery scheme." I felt my knees go weak. Emily emerged from down the road, her camera still running, her face streaked with tears. When she reached me, I finally exhaled. For the first time in months, the air felt light again. Reporters swarmed as deputies loaded Kemp and Marjorie into separate cruisers. The microphones came fast. "Mr. Lawson, how long has this been going on? Did you expect this outcome? What do you want to say to the board?" I didn't give them the satisfaction of anger or bitterness. I just looked straight into the camera and said, "We bought our homes. We built our lives here. And no one, no board, no bylaw, no fake authority has the right to take that away." The crowd applauded softly. Even some of the neighbors who'd turned their backs on me clapped, shame written all over their faces. But the real twist came later that afternoon. While deputies processed evidence inside the HOA office, Don called me over. On the table lay a file box labeled Stonewood Properties, LLC. Inside were dozens of signed transfer deeds, homes reclaimed by the HOA, all resold to the same company. Guess who owned that company? Marjorie. She had been flipping confiscated homes for profit under a shell corporation, laundering hundreds of thousands through maintenance assessments. Every fine, every fake rule, it all led back to that. By the time the sun set, the entire neighborhood knew. News vans lined the street. Social media lit up. HOA scandal in Maplewood Heights trended locally within hours. The illusion of control the board had built for years collapsed overnight. I watched from my porch as deputies sealed the HOA office. The golden tree emblem, once their symbol of power, now sat cracked and crooked against the boarded door. Emily stood beside me, her hand finding mine. "It's over," she whispered. I shook my head slowly. "Not yet, but it will be." That night, as the flashing lights faded and silence returned to the street, I sat on my porch and thought about how close they'd come to taking everything. How fragile the line was between peace and tyranny when the wrong people held the pen that wrote the rules. But there was something else, too, vindication. The next morning, an emergency meeting was held at the community center, this time under county supervision. The remaining board members resigned one by one, their faces gray and hollow. Diane approached the microphone at the end, voice trembling. "We were told we were helping the community," she said, "but we were helping her steal it." I watched without emotion. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't gloat. I didn't rage. I just told the truth. "This community was built on trust," I said, my voice steady. "And they poisoned it. But now we rebuild. Together." Applause erupted. Not the forced, polite kind from HOA meetings, but something real. Afterward, as people filed out, one of the deputies approached me. "You handled yourself well, Mr. Lawson. Most folks would have lost it long ago," I smiled faintly. "I almost did," he nodded toward the cabin. "You ever think about leaving?" "Every day," I said. "But this is home." That night, As Emily and I sat by the window watching the neighborhood lights flicker back on, she turned to me. "Do you think they'll ever stop trying?" I looked out at the empty HOA building, the county seal taped across its door. "Maybe not," I said. "But next time they try to take something that isn't theirs, they'll remember what happened here." The house creaked softly in the night air. The sound wasn't haunting anymore. It was grounding, real. Somewhere out there, I knew Marjorie and Kemp were sitting in holding cells, waiting for lawyers who wouldn't be able to save them. Justice wasn't just poetic. It was tangible. And as I finally closed my eyes, one thought settled in like a whisper. You can build walls, write bylaws, and hide behind authority. But when you steal from people who have nothing left to lose, you're the one who should be afraid. The first morning after it all ended, I woke up to silence. Real silence. Not the kind that hums beneath your skin with tension, waiting for the next letter on your doorstep or the next knock from a board member pretending to check on compliance. This was the kind of silence that felt earned, the kind that came after a storm finally burned itself out. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, warm and golden, landing across the table where months of paperwork once sat. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cedar, the familiar grounding scent I'd almost forgotten. For the first time in nearly a year, I didn't wake up bracing myself for a fight. The house felt lighter, freer, like it could finally breathe again. News of the arrests had spread faster than wildfire. Within hours of Marjorie and Kemp being taken into custody, the entire Maplewood Heights community had turned into a buzzing hive of whispers, texts, and shock. By the next day, it wasn't just whispers, it was outrage. Neighbors who had once stood silent began speaking up. They shared their own stories of intimidation and deceit, phony landscaping violations, unexplained fines, threats about property lines. It turned out I wasn't the only one. I was just the first to push back hard enough for something to crack. By the end of that week, Maplewood Heights was unrecognizable. The golden HOA seal that once hung at the entrance, gleaming and proud, was gone. Someone had taken it down during the night and left it lying in the grass like a fallen crown. Nobody bothered to put it back up. The county had assigned an interim administrator to oversee all HOA operations during the investigation. Her name was Carla Reyes, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who didn't flinch at the mess she'd walked into. The first time she visited my house, she shook my hand firmly and said, "Mr. Lawson, you're the reason I'm standing here. Let's clean this up." And she meant it. Every file, every record, every backroom decision the old board had made was combed through. It took weeks, but the truth came spilling out in waves. Marjorie had embezzled over $600,000 through fake contracts and shell maintenance companies. Kemp had doctored minutes, faked votes, and even blackmailed dissenting board members into silence. They weren't just corrupt, they were predators. When the news outlets got hold of the details, Maplewood Heights became national news. Reporters camped out by the community gates, capturing shots of the once perfect neighborhood, now stripped bare of its glossy image. Suburban Scandal, the HOA that went too far, read one headline. Another said, "How one homeowner brought down the most feared HOA in the county." It was surreal, seeing my quiet street on TV, the same sidewalks where I used to mow the lawn, now filled with cameras and lights. But beneath the spectacle, there was something healing in it. The truth wasn't just out, it was undeniable. Neighbors began to approach me differently. The same people who once avoided eye contact now stopped me at the mailbox. "I'm sorry," they'd say. "We didn't know how bad it was." Or, "We thought you were overreacting. I didn't hold grudges." Not anymore, because in some way, we had all been under that same spell, the illusion of order, of civility, of belonging to something that looked good from the outside, but was rotten underneath. The HOA office was officially dissolved 2 months later. The state attorney's office ordered a full liquidation of its assets, and the proceeds were distributed to the homeowners as restitution. When I opened the letter stating my share, $42,870, it wasn't about the money. It was about what it meant, acknowledgement. Proof that what they did was wrong. Marjorie's trial was swift. The evidence was airtight. Watching her sit in that courtroom, her hair pulled back, her once perfect posture sagging under the weight of her own arrogance, I felt, not triumph exactly, but closure. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. Kemp got 5 for conspiracy and document forgery. During the hearing, the judge read aloud the list of homeowners they had wronged. Dozens of names. Mine was near the top. When it echoed through the courtroom, Marjorie looked at me for the first time. No words, no defiance left. Just emptiness. After the verdict, people clapped quietly. It wasn't a celebration. It was a release. In the months that followed, Maplewood Heights began to change. Without the iron grip of the HOA, people rediscovered what community actually meant. Fences that had once divided us, literal and emotional, started coming down. Families helped each other repaint, repair, rebuild. We held the first neighborhood cookout in years, the kind where kids ran barefoot and nobody worried about whether the coolers were aesthetically compliant. I didn't think I'd ever be part of something like that again. But there I was, flipping burgers next to the same guy who'd once filed a complaint about my mailbox paint. We laughed about it, awkwardly at first, then genuinely. Emily filmed the whole event for her channel. You know, she said, zooming in on the family's mingling, people online are obsessed with this story. They keep saying it feels like justice finally won one. Justice, I repeated, watching the sun dip low over the rooftops. Yeah, feels like it. The county eventually allowed the neighborhood to self-manage again, but this time under a new charter. No HOA, no board, no hidden agendas. Just a voluntary community association run transparently by residents. Every vote public, every expense visible. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time, that was enough. Months passed. The grass grew thicker, greener. My house stood unscathed, proud, unboarded. The trees I planted years ago swayed in the breeze, whispering like they always had. Life had rhythm again. Sometimes, though, I'd find remnants of the past. A faded HOA letter buried in a drawer. A notice of violation tucked between old bills. I never threw them away. I kept them in a box labeled proof. Not as a reminder of pain, but of survival. One afternoon, a young couple knocked on my door. They were new, bought a house down the street, one that had once been seized by the HOA. The woman smiled shyly. "We heard you're the reason this neighborhood is still standing," she said. I chuckled. I just got tired of bullies. Her husband nodded. "Still, thank you for fighting back. We read everything about what happened. Hard to believe it got that bad." "Yeah," I said softly. "It's hard to believe until it happens to you. They left a pie as a thank you." I watched them walk back home, their laughter echoing through the quiet street. And I realized that the neighborhood had found something it hadn't had in years: hope. Meanwhile, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Interviews, documentaries, podcasts. Everyone wanted the HOA story guy, but I didn't want fame. I wanted peace. So I turned most of them down, except one. A local journalist, the same one who'd first aired my footage, asked me, "Do you regret any of it? The fight, the chaos, the toll it took?" I thought about the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the neighbors who turned their backs, the moments I doubted my own sanity. Then I thought about standing in my own yard again, free. "No," I said. Because the truth is, peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's what you build after surviving it. The article went viral. People from across the country started reaching out. Homeowners, renters, small communities struggling under similar HOAs. Some shared horror stories worse than mine. Others just said, "Thank you. You made us feel less alone." That hit me harder than I expected. Because for months I had felt alone, trapped, dismissed. But now that isolation had turned into something powerful, a movement. By the 1-year anniversary of Marjorie's arrest, Maplewood Heights had become a case study in HOA reform. Lawmakers even cited it during a state hearing about property owner protections. New legislation passed, limiting the powers of HOAs to levy fines and seize properties. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever been silenced by bureaucracy dressed as community spirit. Emily and I sat in the audience that day as the bill passed. When the chamber erupted in applause, she squeezed my hand. "You realize you started all this?" She whispered. I smiled faintly. "No," I just stopped running. Afterward, life quieted down again, the way I'd always wanted it to. My garden flourished. I built a new fence, shorter, simpler, no HOA approval needed. Every morning, I'd sit on the porch with my coffee and watch the sunrise spill over the neighborhood, washing everything in gold. Sometimes I'd see the older residents walking their dogs, chatting without fear. Kids racing bikes down the street, their laughter unbothered by rules about noise after 7 p.m. The street that once felt suffocating was alive again, and yet, on certain nights when the wind would rattle through the trees, I'd remember those long months of battle, the paperwork, the threats, the sound of hammers boarding up my windows. I'd think about how close they came to erasing me. It didn't scare me anymore. It grounded me, because I knew now, power only works when people stop questioning it. In the end, Maplewood Heights wasn't destroyed. It was reborn. But not because the system fixed itself, because the people who lived there decided they'd had enough. Justice hadn't come easy. It had come with bruises, sleepless nights, and scars you couldn't see. But it had come, and every time I saw that fallen HOA emblem lying in the grass by the entrance, the one nobody ever bothered to pick back up, I left it there, as a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets accountability. Years from now, maybe people will forget the details. Maybe they'll just remember that something big happened here, something that cracked the facade of perfection and showed what lies underneath. But I'll remember it all. The noise, the fear, the anger, and finally, the quiet that followed. Because peace, real peace, isn't given. It's earned. And if you're lucky enough to have it, never let anyone convince you they can take it away. After all, power only lasts until someone stands up and says no more. So, tell me, if it were your home, your peace, your freedom, how far would you go to take it back?